This video is sponsored by Only Crits. Welcome to my Worldbreaking series, where I take a look at aspects of D&D that tend to get banned a lot, break down the reasons why, and offer my 2 cents. The goal of this series isn't to tell you what's right or wrong, it's just to help you be able to make your own decision. Today we're tackling subclasses, which is by far the most requested subject for me to discuss in this series, because there are a lot of subclasses that people have some strong opinions about. First, let's start with the obvious. Technically, the only subclasses you need to worry about are the ones in the player's handbook. In theory. See, every other Wizards of the Coast book is very clear that the subclasses they present can only be approved for use in the campaign via the Dungeon Master's discretion. So they aren't actually a part of the game by default, the way the subclasses in the player's handbook are assumed to be. This is doubly true for anything put out by any other 5e publisher, with the added wrinkle that even finding out about other subclasses from other publishers means you'd have to do some research. Wizards of the Coast's products are so ubiquitous, you can find them in Barnes & Noble and Target for crying out loud, and almost no other 5e publisher can compete with that presence. So, because of that difference in visibility, it's far more likely someone will want to play a subclass from a Wizards of the Coast book rather than a subclass from Kobold Press or Drive-Thru-RPG. And then we have to add the fact that so many D&D groups use D&D Beyond by default, because it's a pretty good resource, so that's yet another reason why your players are far more likely to ask about playing an additional Wizards of the Coast subclass and not one from a third party. The caveat there is that the Oath of the Open Sea Paladin subclass from Critical Role's Tal'Dorei Reborn book is up on D&D Beyond. I believe it's the only third-party subclass on the website. Now, D&D Beyond adds another wrinkle we need to talk about. The fact that it shows all of these subclasses to a new player, usually by default. Now, you can turn on and off the settings for what it shows when you're creating the character, but I don't know what the defaults are for everyone who creates a new character. And more importantly, the subclasses from Xanathar's Guide to Everything and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything are always part of the default. Even if I toggle off all of those options, it still shows me those Xanathar and Tasha's subclasses. So literally, unless you don't give those players access to those books at all, there doesn't seem to be an obvious way to stop them from being able to choose those subclasses when building the character on their own. And the funny thing is, this actually seems to be a literal representation of the same problem that happens at home tables. Because in my experience, most players are going to assume the subclasses from Xanathar's and Tasha's will be approved. They might still ask for permission, but generally, at a lot of tables, it's assumed you're going to say yes and let them play any official Wizards of the Coast subclass. Now, this is not universal. Some of you might have been really clear with your players right up front, or you're playing with people who are really respectful of your authority as the GM, and that's a good thing. But based on what I've seen, it's far more likely for players to assume that a subclass is okay, especially if they're finding it in an official book from Wizards of the Coast, and doubly especially if they're seeing it on D&D Beyond alongside all of the other subclasses, with no distinction being made about where it's being sourced from. And this, unfortunately, is the nature of playing D&D right now, especially through online tools. It's tough to reconcile, because even if you play physically, like we did for decades, someone can still get their hands on a physical book and bring it to the table. Technically, the best solution is for your players to not buy their own books, but going out and buying their own books is also a way for them to show that they are invested in the game. Literally. And the more players who have books at the table, the better. And if you're playing digitally, it's hard to deny that there are some terrific perks to D&D Beyond that arguably might outweigh the downsides for you. Obviously, your mileage may vary on that front, and we as a community are starting to have a conversation about whether or not D&D Beyond is good for our groups for a lot of these exact reasons. And that conversation is really going to come to a head next year when the new edition comes out. I have a feeling we're going to find out exactly how good or bad D&D Beyond is for the hobby overall. But ultimately, my point is this. It's actually really hard to hide subclasses from your players if you don't want those subclasses to be used in your games. So ultimately, the best way to remove a subclass from consideration is to talk to your players. I know, this is yet another video where the secret is healthy communication. I'm very predictable. But seriously, if you don't want players to use a subclass, you need to tell them that. And I'd recommend you also tell them exactly why. And now, a word from our sponsor. Alright guys, good game. Look, we need to talk. I like you a lot, but when we get together with my friends, you can't behave that way. I know, you're just being yourself. I mean, you're called Only Crits Dice. I should have expected you to roll well, but seriously, that was almost a total party kill. You can't treat my friends that way. I'm not trying to stifle you. I think you're incredible, but you roll so well. Frankly, shockingly well. Honestly, it's astonishing you're as affordable as you are. I know. Look, I shouldn't have tried to fudge your rolls. I brought you to this game for a reason. There's a reason I didn't use digital dice. You're my favorite dice I've ever owned, and I'm still glad I got to show you off to my friends, even if it was a little bumpy today. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to... Screw it. It's true, you're the best dice I've ever owned. No, really, I'm being sincere. Look, why don't I get you something nice? Only Crits has some absolutely incredible dice vaults and dice bags on their website. Why don't we get you something to wear the next time we're with my friends? I'll talk to my friends, don't worry. I'll tell them to go to onlycrits.com/supergeekmike. I'm sure once they see the amazing selection, all will be forgiven. Plus, if they want to support me, and they should, they're my friends, then they can use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, and that will actually really help me a lot. Now come on, let's get you something fancy. Once again, that's onlycrits.com/supergeekmike, and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout. Thank you again to Only Crits for sponsoring this video. So, why would you ban a subclass? Well, back in January, I made a video about game balance. If you haven't watched it, go check it out. It's kind of essential viewing in order for us to navigate this topic. Because a lot of subclasses get banned because of one thing: game balance. Now, there are probably exceptions. I could see someone banning a subclass because the lore around it doesn't work for their game, or because it encourages a style of play they're not into. For example, if you're not running an evil game, then yeah, maybe you don't want anyone to have access to the death domain for clerics. It's a pretty sinister subclass, it's why it's in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Or maybe there are lore reasons why the planes in your world aren't easy to access. Maybe there's no planar travel at all in your campaign, so the Horizon Walker Ranger doesn't fit your setting. But by and large, the most common reason given for banning a subclass is because it's too powerful. I mean, it's possible you're someone who bans a subclass because it's too weak, and you're trying to keep your players from having a bad time by selecting something that's going to make their play miserable. And if that's the case, fair enough, you're being considerate and trying to curate the experience for your friends. But that tends not to be the reason I see given for why most subclasses are banned. Honestly, most subclasses are banned because they're perceived as being too powerful. And it is true that a lot of the subclasses in Xanathar's Guide to Everything and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything are more powerful than the ones in the Player's Handbook. Not across the board, but generally. In truth, this impacts more than just subclasses. Even different races that appear in later books, different versions of the same race that appear in later books, tend to be a lot more powerful. And this brings us to the topic of power creep. See, Wizards of the Coast is in a dilemma. They want to keep selling books because they need to keep showing revenue, because we live under a broken system where every company has to show continued financial growth every year or they're considered a failure, and that's a doomed strategy that can really only end one way, but we're not going to be able to fix that problem today. Wizards of the Coast wants to keep selling books because that's how they make more money. And they also know that the best way to sell books is to include content for players, because there are more D&D players than there are Dungeon Masters. Sure, Dungeon Masters might buy more books overall since they need to buy adventures and maybe setting books, and they'll also probably buy the books of new player options, but there are a lot more players and therefore a larger audience for a book with new races and classes and subclasses and feats and spells. But you also want to make these new books appealing, so you want to put something into these books that the players will really want. That's why these subclasses tend to be, really cool. And one way to make something cool, not the only way, but certainly a viable way, is to make it powerful. And so, generally speaking, a lot of the new subclasses wind up being stronger than the older ones. And that's how my comments get filled with people talking about how they ban the Twilight domain Cleric. There are a few other subclasses that pop up a few times. A couple of the druid circles from Tasha's get called out as well. I'm sure some folks even ban subclasses from the Player's Handbook. But honestly, more often than not, it's the Twilight Cleric that I see DMs want to ban. We're going to use it as our example in this video because it's a perfect representation of the topic we're discussing today. And look, I'll be fully honest. When Tasha's Cauldron of Everything first came out, so much of the discussion around it was based on the customizable origin options, the custom lineage, and the optional traits to replace the defaults for each class. So those are really the only parts of the book that I read. And you know what? I should really get around to reading this book, so let's take a look inside. Let's see what this Twilight Domain Cleric is all about. Got my copy of Tasha's right here, and let's check out this Twilight Domain Cleric. Okay, yeah, I get it. I really do understand why this subclass is the one that so many DMs don't like. First, at level 1, you get 300 feet of dark vision. I don't know every subclass or every spell in 5e, but based on the ones I've dealt with, it seems like this might be the best dark vision in the entire game. At the very least, it's wildly popular for level 1. Oh, and a few people within 10 feet of you also get the benefit of this same dark vision. Specifically, a number of creatures equal to your wisdom modifier, but that's okay, it's not like clerics usually have incredibly high wisdom scores. Now, in theory, it only lasts an hour, and you can only do it once, but you can do it again if you spend a spell slot. At level 1, that's a tougher choice to make, you don't have that many spell slots to spend. But at higher levels, when you have more slots, you can pretty much guarantee this is going to be used constantly. There are plenty of DMs who already lament how many playable races get dark vision, so anybody who wishes darkness mattered more in their 5e games will, of course, absolutely hate this. You can also give someone advantage on initiative, which, yes, it's powerful for level 1, but honestly I don't think that's a very big deal. Initiative order doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things. At second level, you can create a sphere around you that functionally gives everyone in your party temporary hit points equal to 1d6 plus your cleric level, and you can keep doing it whenever they end their turn near you. That's potentially enough to keep everyone in your party from taking any meaningful damage at low levels. Or you could instead remove the Charmed or Frightened condition from an ally, which is also extremely powerful at low levels. And you can use either trait whenever someone ends their turn near you. That's pretty busted. At 6th level, you can fly for a minute, and it only takes a bonus action to give yourself the power. And you can do it a number of times per day equal to your proficiency bonus. And since most D&D groups don't get into that many combats in a given day, and most D&D combats last less than 10 rounds, functionally this means one player is going to be flying in every single fight. And this flight doesn't come from a concentration spell, so they can't be knocked out of it unless the player is actually knocked unconscious. Well, the player character. I meant the player character. At 8th level, you can add a d8 of radiant damage to a weapon attack, and that becomes 2d8 at level 14. That's not that big a deal, I don't think. And finally, at 17th level, that aura that you got at 2nd level also grants you and your allies half cover. Which, you know what? That's fine. It's an extra +2 to the armor class at 17th level, as long as everyone is within 30 feet of the same person. Most games don't even reach this level. This is really not a big deal. Now, I want to be super clear. I fully understand why so many DMs banned this subclass. And if that's the right approach for your game, more power to you. I just don't think I would do so at my own table. First, with the dark vision situation, I find that I don't worry about darkness that much in my games. Now, this is fully a chicken and egg situation. Do all these spells and races and subclasses not bother me because I don't think about darkness that often? Or do I not think about darkness that often because I've been playing 5e for 9 years and the game doesn't seem to want players to worry about darkness? Regardless of the reason, for many of the games I run, tracking torches has not been a huge part of my style. I don't care about advantage on initiative, partially because it can be granted to any player, partially because it doesn't actually guarantee that someone will roll high, but most of all because my monsters almost never get higher than a 5 when I roll for initiative anyway, so seriously, it doesn't matter who goes first. Now, the Twilight Sanctuary aura is powerful, there is no doubt about that. Sure, it's an action to create, but once it's on the field, it's a pretty big deal. But if my players wanted to play a Twilight Cleric, I would tell them the same thing I said when the spell Healing Spirit was released in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. I would tell my players, sure, I'm going to allow this, and I'm going to scale my monsters up to be powerful enough to still be a threat. It might not happen right away, but my ultimate job is to challenge you in creative ways. So I'll just upgrade my monster's damage with the knowledge that you have access to this spell. When I was running my Princess of the Apocalypse game for 4 druids, they were pretty dang powerful. I mean, they could each summon 8 velociraptors at a time, so they could take down threats long before my monsters ever got a chance to get a hit in, because I roll so low on initiative. And if they did get hit, they could just cast Healing Spirit after the fight and regain all of their hit points. This was the original version of Healing Spirit, not the watered-down version that shows up in the new printings of Xanathar's Guide or on D&D Beyond. And so what did I do? Well, one night while the characters were sleeping at an inn, I dropped 2 ninjas, a demon, and a wizard on them, and it was an extremely brutal struggle. They were in a cramped room with 3 combatants, and a 4th leaning into the room and launching spells at them from behind cover. They summoned the healing spirit, but just getting to it every turn and maintaining concentration on it was a huge challenge. So yes, if one of my players had an aura like this, I do think I would be able to rise to the challenge. Well, speaking of rising, what about the fact that the cleric can fly at 6th level? Well, okay, if they want to soar into the air and dramatically reduce the number of people who will be within their aura, that's fine with me. And honestly, I've got books full of flying monsters, and I can give any of the other monsters wings or just crossbows. The flying is less of an issue than the aura. The Divine Strike doesn't matter, an extra d8 or 2 of radiant damage isn't the end of the world, and I've already pointed out that the half cover at level 17 isn't going to make a huge impact. At level 17, the players are probably fighting monsters with double-digit attack modifiers. Subtracting 2 from a plus 17 attack bonus is not the end of the world. Weirdly, my reaction to the Twilight subclass isn't to blanch at how powerful it is, it's to scratch my head at how some of these traits aren't really thematically linked to the concept of stars in Twilight. What does advantage on initiative have to do with a starry sky? What does flight really represent here, aside from being in the sky, I guess? Again, I'm totally not discounting the feelings of anybody who does choose to ban any subclass for any reason, but my feeling is, I just don't need to. Now, that doesn't mean I won't keep a healthy eye on the subclass as we go if someone takes this in my game. Because we've talked about this before in my game balance video, but balance isn't just about who is too powerful and who is too weak, it's about how these things feel at the table. Sure, functionally it might not matter that one player has the ability to fly when I can just keep throwing flying monsters at them, but that doesn't change the fact that another player not having that same flight ability and feeling frustration over it might mean they aren't having fun at the table. It might be that the Twilight Cleric keeps granting advantage on initiative to the same 2 or 3 people, and even though those people don't go first in every combat, it still might start to feel unfair to the players who feel like they always roll low in initiative. They're not getting that same benefit. It could be that the best tactical decision in every game is just to keep the cleric alive, and that winds up funneling the group into tactics that they wouldn't normally choose to take, like always clumping around the cleric in ways that don't benefit the other player's abilities. Now again, I'm in a great position. I tend to play with people who don't care about balance or FOMO. In my home games, I've done a pretty good job of cultivating players who tend not to feel competitive. They instead rejoice when their fellow players have incredible abilities, and they still live and die by the drama of the campaign. But that might not always be the case. I don't know what trait or boon is going to set off my players and introduce jealousy where there was none. Maybe flying is the ability that makes one of my players go, "Ah, damn, that's not fair." After all, that's literally what happened on Critical Role during the Vox Machina campaign. During the Chroma Conclave arc, flight became kind of a sticking point and caused some of the players to start comparing abilities. So just like I discussed in my video on banning classes, I personally wouldn't keep anyone from bringing a subclass to my table. That's true for the ones in Xanathar's and Tasha's, it's true for anything from another professional 5e publisher, and okay, if it's from the DM's Guild or Twitter or Reddit, I'd be very careful, but I'd be willing to at least let it ride for a few sessions. But no matter what, unless it's a subclass I already know really well, I'd probably tell the player, we might need to keep an eye on the balance and maybe make some adjustments. I'm not above giving each of these abilities a cost, or a side effect, to make sure the game feels a bit more balanced. And if nothing else, the fact that villains and monsters will probably direct a lot of their attacks at the cleric who is emanating darkness and stars and flying overhead might be enough of a cost to keep things feeling balanced. But as I've said, these are just my feelings for my 5e games. That might not make it the right solution for you. So what do you think? Do you tend to ban subclasses or tweak them to make them less powerful? Or more powerful if you find they're too weak? Or do you just let it ride and up the difficulty when needed to keep the game challenging? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support the channel, there are a few ways you can do that. The first is very easy. It's right on the page you're on right now. You can like the video and subscribe to the channel. Those both tell YouTube that this is a video you like and content you enjoy. And make sure to ring the bell so you get notified about my new videos whenever they come out, which is every Monday and Thursday. If you want to support me financially, I am trying to make this my full-time job, so any support you can offer is appreciated. I have a Patreon, and the more patrons who sign up, the more goals I unlock. We are at just over 300 patrons at the time of recording, and when I hit 350 patrons, I'm going to buy a new camera. I'm really hoping that will take care of those visual glitches that come up in my videos. These have been driving me crazy. If you can't support me financially right now, I totally get it. Times are tough these days. You can still join my Discord community and hang out with awesome people who just love TTRPGs and want to help each other run better games. And the fourth way to support the channel is by signing up for my newsletter, where you will get occasional updates about what I've got going on. We talked a lot today about the reason Wizards of the Coast publishes the kinds of books they do, but if you want to know whether you should buy their adventures or make up your own for your campaigns, I made a video comparing the virtues of pre-written modules to homebrew. Be sure to check that out right here. Until next time, play fair and have fun.